And I've offered 5 principles for the ethical development of ubiquitous computing. And this is where my material really does begin to depart from most of the discussions of ubiquity that we see in the literature. Because most of them, and this is proper in academic terms, most of them are descriptive. They are neither prescriptive nor proscriptive. They are explanations of systems that could be developed. They are explorations of possibility space. They are pushing the envelope in terms of what engineering can do. But academics very typically do not say this can be done and should be done, or alternately, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't pursue this line of inquiry. So the ethical language is very, very strange to a technical ear. To a technical audience, it's something that I won't say it's never thought of. Of course, everybody has an ethical sense. People do have these things. But sometimes for the sake of expediency, for the sake of our jobs, or for the sake of our careers, we suppress our ethical instincts, and we forget to ask these questions. So I'd like to present to you what I believe are 5 sound principles for the ethical development of ubiquitous computing. And I will acknowledge to you that they come from my perspective, which is to say an American perspective, an English-speaking perspective, a modernist perspective, a libertarian perspective. All of this to say is that I do not wish or intend for these principles to be definitive. They are nothing of the sort. They are a conversation starter. This refers to the conversation that I discussed at the beginning. I think we need to have a very large conversation about these values. And I think it starts here. I think we must design ubiquitous systems so that they do not harm us, at the very least. Engineers have a principle that's called graceful degradation, and it is a principle that functionality in a system fail progressively as opposed to catastrophically. It fails in little pieces and not all at once. And a very good example of this is the very well-known anti-lock braking system, the ABS module in a car's brakes, which, when you're driving on a rainy surface, automatically pumps the brakes 1,000 times a second because this helps you keep your stability. Well, if an ABS module fails, as it turns out, all you lose is the ability to have that automatic assistance. It doesn't mean the brakes fail. You can still slow the car ordinarily. This is the principle of graceful degradation. To my mind, graceful degradation in the context of ubiquitous computing does not go nearly far enough. It's simply insufficient. And the reason is that because of the appearance of ubiquitous computing everywhere in the environment and in so many different places in our lives, it takes a great deal of responsibility onto itself for our well-being. And I mean that ubiquitous systems must default to a mode that ensures safety of 3 sorts: physical, psychic, and financial. Now, when I say risk and safe, I am perfectly aware that these are charged terms. Every culture has different levels of the kinds of risk that it is willing to accept. And I'm going to describe very briefly 3 societies that I'm familiar with. In America, which is the society I'm most familiar with, we're in a fairly risk-averse period of our evolution as a culture right now. Lawsuits are everywhere. You can get sued for endangering anybody. So that, for example, parents do not let their children play in a playground unless there are signs everywhere warning that the playground is dangerous, unless there is rubber matting underneath the children's play equipment, unless there is video cameras that keep sexual predators from having access to this playground. These are the conditions under which American children grow up. That is considered safety. That is considered a reduction of risk in the American context. In the German context, the German people I know think that's insane. They're like, that's not childhood. How does a child ever learn to explore the world? So my German friends tell me that there's no such thing as a child's playground in Germany that has the rubber matting underneath of it, or the warning signs, or the warnings about liability, or anything of that nature. They consider these to be a little bit silly, if not fundamentally unwise. And the other end of the spectrum is, of course, here in Japan. When you go to the Yamanote-sen, you're told every 5 seconds, well, you know, the escalator is coming to an end. Please take care. Please be careful. Please stand behind the yellow line. You know, the train is coming soon. You have to be careful. Please be careful. Please take care of yourself. You hear these recorded warnings literally 1,000 times or more a day in Japan, and that's because this society has decided that part of its value is that people be cared for. That's how the society has decided to resolve the role of risk and uncertainty. 3 different places three different understandings of what constitutes risk. So when I say that systems must default to harmlessness, I mean that every society has to decide for itself what that word harm means. Nevertheless, I think this should be the gold standard that we approach and aspire to. I think we should try to design ubiquitous systems so that at the very least they keep people from being injured. I think ubiquitous systems should be self-disclosing. I think they must all contain provisions for immediate and transparent querying of who owns them and what they can do and what they intend to do with that. And the icons that you've been seeing, as I've used them as section dividers and I showed them at the beginning, this refers to something that is a challenge that is sort of external to ubiquitous computing proper, but is part of the environmental surround, is part of the social context. These signs are intended to warn people who do not have electronic devices, do not have KTI, do not have informational fluency, perhaps, that these systems are going on in their area. So this is a role for a traditional graphic designer as well. When I say that ubiquitous systems must contain provisions for immediate and transparent querying, I mean both technically and non-technically. Now this begins to engage a very, very deep question in user experience, which is referred to as the juncture between seamfulness and seamlessness. Now let me start with seamlessness. Seamlessness is a word that was devised by Mark Weiser himself in the discussion of ubiquitous systems, and the idea is that you would never know as a user of these systems that, the precise details of their interaction with each other. You would simply live your life. You would ask the world, is there a parking space available at the restaurant I want to go to? Or where did I leave my keys? Or queries of this nature. And you would get an answer. You would never know, you would never need to know about the incredibly elaborate informational infrastructure that facilitated your getting the answer to that question. And this is called seamlessness. And Weiser was ambivalent about seamlessness. He thought that on the one hand, it was necessary to something that he called calm technology, that because these devices would be everywhere in our environment, if they weren't designed in such a way so as to be respectful of our attention, that it would be intolerable. It would be warning buzzers and spoken alerts and vibrating and flashing lights everywhere all the time. It would be completely untenable. The trouble is that the alternative to seamlessness is seamfulness. The alternative to seamlessness is knowing exactly when and what is going on and what zeros and ones are being passed from what device to what database and so on. And this is equally intolerable in its way. I would go so far as to say for the great majority of users, for the great majority of contexts, they do not care how the system works. They just want to live their life. And I think that's a great principle. So I say that seamlessness is desirable under most circumstances, but it must be optional. That is, if you want to reach into the system, and if you are interested and knowledgeable and you want to be able to be actively involved in how you are being affected by the system, you should be able to, no matter how the system is designed, you should be able to open it up and look under the hood and see how it works. And that's why I say that seamlessness must be an optional mode of presentation and not a mandatory one. The third principle is that ubiquitous systems should be conservative of face. They should allow us to save face. They must not unnecessarily embarrass, humiliate, or shame their users. And this is an insight that I had while reading a book, a science fiction book called 334 by a man named Thomas Disch. It was written in 1972. One of the scenes of this book is an elderly hospital attendant in a hospital of the year 2026. And he's in his 70s. He's been working in this hospital a long time. He's got a little bit of Alzheimer's disease coming on. He's not quite there all the time. And on top of that, he's involved in a criminal scam involving the theft and sale of organs from the hospital. So he's very distracted and he's very guilty most of the time. And his job is very simple. His job is to push a supply cart through the corridors of the hospital, following something called Corridor K. That's his route through this entire building. And in his performance of this job, he wears what we would now call an active badge. He wears a name tag that communicates with the building's air traffic control system and lets the building know where he is at all times.